September 22nd, 1943. Before dawn, 4 miles off the coast of Finschhafen, New Guinea, a line of Australian landing craft rode in the dark like low, blunt shadows. Diesel fumes hung over the water. Salt spray blew hard across steel hulls and soaked wool uniforms within minutes. In the packed boats, men sat knee to knee, helmets knocking, rifles held upright because there was nowhere else to put them. The engines never stopped roaring, but the waves were louder now, slamming the bows and sending vibration through the deck plates. Many of the soldiers were already sick. Vomit collected in corners and ran with seawater toward the stern. No one had the energy to clean it. They tried to breathe through their mouths, but the taste of fuel and brine was everywhere. Hands cramped around webbing straps and rifle slings. In the blackness, they could not see faces, only feel bodies shaking beside them and hear short, controlled breaths that sounded too fast. These were not the first boats. 3 assault waves had gone ahead into the same darkness. The men in the 4th wave listened for what should have come next. Gunfire from the beach, signal flares, a shout over the radio, anything that said the landing had begun. Nothing came. There was radio silence. No traces, no explosions, no return signal from the shoreline. Only the water and the steady grind of engines pushing toward it. Off the bow, the coast was a darker band against the sky. The jungle massed behind the beach with no lights and no movement. The quiet did not feel like safety. It felt like waiting. In the boats, men checked the weight of their equipment without speaking. Each carried a full combat load: rifle and ammunition, grenades, water, rations, tools, sometimes mortar rounds or radio parts. On land, it was heavy but manageable. In water, it could become something else entirely. A few of them understood that. A corporal who had worked around Sydney's harbour watched the waves and the way the craft rose and dropped. He had seen boats broach and roll when they hit something unseen. He did not like the spacing between wave sets or the way the current tugged at the bows. He said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. A private from Queensland, who had never been comfortable around deep water, kept his eyes fixed forward. He did not know what the beach looked like. He could not judge distance in the dark. He only knew the ramp would drop and he would have to step out with the others. The first hint of trouble was not a shot. It was the sound of metal meeting something that was not sand. Ahead, somewhere in the black, a landing craft struck hard. The impact carried across the water as a dull clang, then another. Engines revved, then changed pitch, as if fighting to pull free. A moment later, the sea seemed to rise around the boats, and the surf noise grew sharper, closer, more violent. In less than a minute, hundreds of Australians would learn that the Japanese were not the most immediate threat on that beach. The ocean was. By September 1943, the war in the Southwest Pacific had shifted in momentum, but not in intensity. General Douglas MacArthur's advance along the northern coast of New Guinea was deliberate and costly. Each airstrip, each harbour, each stretch of coastline was a step toward the Philippines and, beyond that, toward Japan itself. New Guinea was not simply jungle, it was a chain of airfields and sea lanes. Whoever controlled them controlled movement across the Bismarck Sea. Finschhafen sat at a critical point on the Huon Peninsula. It overlooked the Vitiaz Strait, the narrow passage between New Guinea and New Britain. Through that strait ran Japanese shipping routes that sustained garrisons across the region. If Allied forces seized Finschhafen, they would threaten those routes directly. Aircraft based there could strike shipping and isolate enemy troops further west. Leh had fallen only days earlier. Salamaua was secured after months of fighting. But those victories meant little without firm control of the peninsula. Intelligence indicated that elements of the Japanese 20th Division were entrenched inland, experienced troops transferred from campaigns in China. They understood defensive warfare and had prepared positions in dense terrain that favoured concealment and ambush. The landing at what would later be called Scarlet Beach was not a raid. It was the opening move in a campaign designed to break Japanese resistance along the Huon coast. If successful, the operation would cut off thousands of Japanese soldiers from reinforcement and resupply. Their lines of communication would narrow to a dangerous corridor exposed to Allied air and naval power. Over time, isolation would weaken them more effectively than frontal assault. If the landing failed, the consequences would ripple outward. Reinforcements would have to be reorganized, naval assets redeployed. The timetable for the broader New Guinea offensive could slip by weeks or months. In a theatre where distance and weather already slowed operations, delay meant opportunity for the enemy to regroup. The assault force centred on the Australian 9th Division. Hardened in North Africa, they had earned a reputation for endurance under pressure. Now they operated alongside United States naval destroyers and air units assigned to provide fire support and cover at first light. High Command expected speed. Plans called for the beachhead to be secured quickly, allowing engineers to move ashore and begin preparing ground for aircraft operations. Within 72 hours, Finschhafen town itself was to be threatened. The schedule assumed that the landing would proceed according to plan. It assumed a navigable shoreline. It assumed reliable communications between sea and land. It assumed that the first waves would establish order, not confusion. In amphibious warfare, timing was decisive. Naval vessels could not linger in exposed coastal waters after daylight without risking air attack. Air support required precise coordination to avoid striking friendly forces. Supplies depended on an intact beachhead, marked and secured. Everything rested on those first hours before sunrise. The Japanese defenders were expected to resist. They were not expected to be the only obstacle. As the landing craft approached the dark outline of Finschhafen's coast, the strategic importance of the objective was clear to commanders studying maps far from the surf. What was less clear, and not marked on any chart provided to the assault troops, was the hidden geography beneath the tide. And it was that unseen geography that would shape the battle before a single rifle was fired. The men in the landing craft belonged primarily to the 20th Australian Infantry Brigade of the 9th Division. They were not inexperienced soldiers. Many had fought through the siege of Tobruk and the battles of El Alamein. They had endured artillery barrages, armoured assaults, and months of desert heat that cracked skin and equipment alike. They understood fear, and they understood discipline. Their brigade commander, Brigadier Victor Windire, was 42 years old. In civilian life, he had been a barrister, precise in argument and measured in judgment. In North Africa, he had commanded under intense pressure and earned the trust of his officers. He believed in preparation, in clear orders, in steady control. But the Western Desert had been open and visible. New Guinea was enclosed, wet and unpredictable. Among the soldiers were men whose lives before the war had little connection to oceans or jungles. Private Jack Morrison of the 215th Battalion had grown up on a sheep property in Queensland. Before enlisting, he had rarely travelled beyond his district. The sea had been something distant, described rather than known. In training, he learned to march, to fire, to dig, to endure. Swimming was not required. Now he sat in darkness with water striking the hull, aware that within minutes he would step into it carrying more weight than he had ever borne in a river or dam. Corporal Bill Henderson of the 217th Battalion had worked on the docks in Sydney. He knew tides and currents, had handled rope and cargo in heavy weather. He could read water better than most infantrymen. As the landing craft rose and fell in the swell, he noticed details others did not. The uneven rhythm of the surf, the way the bow drifted slightly offline between engine surges. He felt unease, not about enemy fire, but about what lay beneath the surface. Lieutenant Tom Crawford, commanding a platoon scheduled for one of the later waves, had spent the previous days studying intelligence briefings. Maps showed a stretch of beach suitable for amphibious landing. Contours appeared manageable. The plan assumed firm sand and predictable depth. He memorized grid references and objectives beyond the shoreline. There was no marking for coral. Each man carried a combat load weighing roughly 60 pounds or more. Rifles with fixed bayonets, ammunition bandoliers, grenades, water bottles, rations for days, entrenching tools. Some carried mortar components or radio batteries wrapped in canvas against spray. Wool uniforms, heavy when dry, absorbed moisture quickly. Webbing straps tightened as they swelled. Boots, once soaked, would cling to the feet like anchors. They were exhausted before the landing began. The sea voyage north had been uncomfortable and cramped. Many had slept poorly. Seasickness had drained strength and dulled concentration. Yet no one suggested postponement. Orders were clear. The assault would proceed before dawn to achieve surprise. From the decks, they could now see the faint outline of the shoreline. A dark mass of jungle pressed close behind what appeared to be a narrow strip of sand. No lights showed, no muzzle flashes. The quiet could mean absence or preparation. Conversation in the boats had diminished to brief exchanges. Check your sling. Keep close. Watch the man ahead. There were no speeches. The veterans of North Africa understood that survival often depended on small actions performed without hesitation. But this environment was unfamiliar. The air was heavier. The water was deeper. The terrain was hidden. They were prepared to fight an enemy in the trees. They were not prepared to fight the sea itself. As the landing craft pushed forward, engines straining against swell and current, the men of the 20th Brigade waited for the ramp to fall. They expected gunfire. They did not expect the ocean to strike first. The briefing had been direct and confident. The selected stretch of coastline was described as a gently sloping beach with firm sand and moderate surf. Landing craft would approach in sequence, lower their ramps in waist-deep water, and infantry would advance quickly beyond the tide line to establish a perimeter. Engineers and heavier equipment would follow once the first waves secured ground. Nothing in the orders suggested a major natural hazard. What the maps did not show was a coral reef lying roughly 200 yards offshore. At high tide, it remained submerged and invisible from the sea. Beneath the surface, it formed an uneven barrier of jagged limestone, sharp enough to tear open hulls and irregular enough to trap boats at awkward angles. Nor did the briefings account for the local currents. Along that stretch of the Huon Peninsula, tidal flow shifted direction every few hours. Rip currents formed without warning, pulling sideways across the landing zone. The beach itself dropped sharply in places. A man stepping forward might move from knee-deep water to over his head within 2 strides. At approximately 0530 hours, the first wave reached the reef. Landing craft struck coral with a grinding impact that echoed through their hulls. Some stopped abruptly, their propellers churning against stone. Coxswains attempted to reverse, but the tide pressed them forward and sideways. Ramps were lowered under the assumption that the depth was manageable. Men stepped out expecting shallow water. Instead, they fell into depths exceeding their height. With full equipment loads, many went under immediately. Wool uniforms absorbed water at once. Ammunition pouches dragged at their waists. Rifles pulled downward. Some soldiers managed to unclip straps or shed packs. Others did not have time. Within minutes, the second wave approached, unaware of the full scale of what had occurred ahead. From a distance, they saw shapes in the water, helmets floating, equipment drifting. Coxswains tried steering around stranded craft, only to encounter different sections of reef. Boats lodged at angles, ramps jammed or dropped into deep channels. Men jumped over the sides rather than wait, misjudging the depth in darkness. The third wave attempted to land further north, seeking clearer water. There they encountered strong lateral current. Boats turned broadside to the surf and struck coral with greater force. Some infantry were thrown into the sea before ramps fully lowered. Equipment scattered across a widening area, carried by tide. The problem compounded rapidly. Approximately 500 soldiers were in or near the water across a broad frontage. Many were unable to swim effectively. Training in North Africa had not included amphibious landings under combat load. Some men had grown up far from large bodies of water. Communication broke down. Radios intended for coordination became soaked or were lost entirely. In darkness and engine noise, cries for help were difficult to distinguish from shouted orders. Attempting to rescue a struggling comrade risked pulling another man under. Weapons disappeared beneath the surface. Early estimates suggested that a significant proportion of small arms and ammunition from the first waves were lost before reaching shore. Mortar components sank with their crews. Medical kits, wrapped but not waterproof, filled and became unusable. Naval vessels supporting the operation could not close the reef without risking grounding. Air support was scheduled after sunrise. Beaches needed to be marked clearly to avoid friendly fire. Yet the men closest to the shore had neither signals nor reliable communication. The strategic implications were immediate. If too many soldiers drowned or became scattered, the landing force would be too weak to secure a perimeter. Withdrawal was not a realistic option. Once daylight arrived, Japanese aircraft could strike exposed ships. Remaining offshore invited greater danger. The clock moved towards 6:15 hours. Dawn would come within half an hour. Additional waves were already en route, unaware of the full extent of the reef and current. Command aboard ship had incomplete information. Reports were fragmentary. On the waterline and beyond it, individual soldiers faced a simple, unforgiving reality. Reach the shore, or sink. The enemy in the jungle had not yet fired a shot, but the landing had already become a fight for survival. At approximately 05:30 hours, the first wave struck the reef with a violent jolt. Private Jack Morrison felt the landing craft shudder beneath him, metal scraping against stone. The engine raced, then faltered. The ramp clanged downward into darkness. He saw no sand. He stepped forward as ordered and dropped straight into deep water. The weight of his rifle and ammunition dragged him under at once. Salt water filled his mouth before he could react. For a brief moment, he could not tell which direction was up. Instinct, not training, saved him. He twisted free of his pack straps and forced himself upward. When he broke the surface, he gasped and reached for anything solid. Around him, men were struggling, some silent, some shouting. 3 from his section did not reappear. The second wave arrived within minutes. Corporal Bill Henderson, watching from his craft, saw debris floating, helmets, webbing, a motionless figure face down in the swell. Their coxswain tried to steer around the stranded boats. The hull struck coral at an angle and stuck fast. The ramp jammed half open. Henderson ordered his men over the sides to avoid piling up. He grabbed a young private who admitted he could not swim. Both went under in the surge. Henderson kicked hard and dragged the man upward, but another wave tore them apart. Henderson surfaced alone and began moving toward what he hoped was shallower ground. By 0600 hours, the pattern was visible even in the dim light. Lieutenant Tom Crawford's platoon, part of the 5th wave, approached through scattered boats resting crooked on the reef. He understood that slowing would only trap them as well. He ordered the coxswain to maintain speed and aim for a darker channel between coral heads. The hull struck hard, grinding forward. Wood splintered. Water rushed in through a torn section near the bow. But the impact carried them closer to shore before momentum failed. The ramp dropped into water that reached chest height rather than overhead. Crawford shouted for his men to move quickly and maintain contact. Behind them, the craft began to settle lower as it filled. In the surf, soldiers formed improvised lines. Stronger swimmers linked arms with those struggling. Equipment was cut loose without hesitation. Mortar tubes, radio batteries, ammunition boxes, items considered essential hours earlier, were abandoned to prevent drowning. Morrison reached a patch of sand where the water fell to his knees. He collapsed briefly, then looked back toward the reef. Dozens of figures remained in difficulty. Without a rifle or pack, he returned to the surf and seized a man pinned beneath the weight of a radio set. Together, they unbuckled the straps and let the equipment sink. Between 0620 and 0640 hours, the scene remained confused. Boats still grounded offshore. Men moving in uneven groups toward land. Others swept sideways by current and forced to fight their way diagonally toward the beach. When Crawford gathered his platoon on firmer sand, he counted quickly. Of 32 who had boarded with him, 21 stood present. Several were without weapons. All were soaked. Ammunition pouches were lighter than they should have been. No radio sets functioned. As first light approached, the sixth wave received warning about the reef and diverted to a slightly different stretch of coastline. There, with improved spacing, they achieved a more successful landing. Swimmers carried rope lines back through the surf to guide later craft. The drowning rate began to decline. But the cost had already been paid. By approximately 0700 hours, hundreds of Australians stood scattered along the beach, many without full equipment, some wounded, many exhausted from the struggle against water. They had not yet encountered organised enemy fire. That silence was ending. At 0745 hours, a single rifle shot cracked from the tree line. Then another. Moments later, a machine gun opened from concealed cover north of the landing point, sending sand erupting around men still trying to regroup. The ocean had taken its toll. Now the defenders of the jungle were ready to test what remained. At 0745 hours, the quiet ended completely. Japanese machine guns opened from concealed positions along the jungle edge. Tracer fire cut low across the sand. Bullets struck the beach in tight lines, indicating that range had already been measured. The Australians were exposed. There were no dunes or substantial rocks to provide cover. Men dropped flat, pressing into wet sand that offered little protection. Some attempted to return fire, only to discover that rifles clogged with salt and grit would not cycle properly. Bolts jammed. Cartridges misfed. Precious seconds were spent clearing chambers while fire continued. Lieutenant Tom Crawford tried to assemble a fire team near a patch of driftwood. He realized that several in his platoon no longer had functioning weapons. Others possessed only a handful of rounds that had survived immersion. 3 men were hit within the first minute, unable to move from open ground. Brigadier Victor Windire, moving along the line despite the danger, faced an immediate decision. Remaining pinned on the beach would invite further losses. Withdrawal into the surf was impossible. The only terrain offering concealment lay 50 yards ahead, the dense tree line from which the fire originated. He gave a simple order: fix bayonets. Around 0800 hours, whistles sounded. Groups of Australians rose from prone positions and advanced toward the jungle. They did not move in perfect formation. They moved because remaining still meant certain casualties. Private Morrison, now without his original rifle, carried only a grenade salvaged from his pocket. He ran with others toward the firing flashes in the foliage. Corporal Henderson had retrieved a floating Lee Enfield from the shallows. It held limited ammunition, but it functioned. The distance was short but exposed. Several men fell before reaching the first trees. Once inside the undergrowth, visibility narrowed to a few yards. Japanese bunkers, constructed for defense against a seaborne approach, proved less effective at extremely close range. Hand-to-hand fighting followed. Grenades were thrown into openings cut into earthen mounds. Bayonets were used in confined spaces. Morrison encountered a Japanese soldier emerging from a concealed position. Without time to reload or reposition, he grappled at close quarters. When the struggle ended, he found himself holding the opponent's rifle. Crawford was struck in the thigh during the advance. The wound shattered bone, forcing him to relinquish command. Henderson assumed control of their immediate section and pushed forward, directing men toward the main machine gun nest that had enfiladed the beach. By approximately 0830 hours, several forward bunkers had been cleared. The intensity of fire from the northern position decreased. The Australians had gained a narrow strip of jungle behind the beach, enough to deny the enemy direct observation of the shoreline. The respite was brief. Around 0900 hours movement deeper in the vegetation signaled organized resistance. Japanese troops, estimated at company strength, advanced toward the recently secured line. Their objective was evident: drive the Australians back into open sand and toward the water. Ammunition supplies were critically low. Many rifles had fewer than 10 rounds remaining. Mortars were unavailable, having been lost during the landing. Naval gunfire could not be requested with precision due to failed radios and proximity to friendly positions. VidAI concentrated remaining ammunition on the southern flank, where pressure was greatest. Men without cartridges prepared to hold ground with bayonets and captured weapons. The Japanese assault closed to short range. Australians withheld fire until targets were within clear sight. A controlled volley disrupted the first rush. A second exchange slowed the next. When rifles clicked empty, fighting continued at close quarters. Henderson stood over the wounded Crawford, using his rifle as a thrusting weapon after expending his last rounds. Morrison, wielding the captured Arisaka, struck at figures emerging through foliage until the immediate pressure eased. By approximately 0945 hours, the counterattack faltered. The Japanese force withdrew incrementally into deeper jungle, leaving the contested ground in Australian hands. Silence returned in fragments. The beachhead extended perhaps 200 yards inland along parts of the line. Casualties lay across sand and undergrowth. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Communications remained unreliable. The Australians had survived both the sea and the first coordinated enemy attempt to reverse the landing. They held the ground. For the moment, it was enough. By mid-morning on September 22, 1943, the immediate crisis had passed, but the cost was becoming clear. Makeshift aid posts were established just inside the tree line. There were no proper stretchers at first, only rifles and ground sheets used to carry the wounded. Medical orderlies worked with limited supplies. Many bandages were improvised. Salt water was used to rinse sand from open wounds when nothing else was available. Lieutenant Tom Crawford was moved carefully to a shaded position. The bullet had shattered his thigh. A field dressing slowed the bleeding, but he would require evacuation. He remained conscious and calm, asking for a situation report before accepting morphine later in the day. Corporal Bill Henderson assisted in organizing defensive positions while helping carry injured men. He declined immediate rest. The beach still felt exposed, and he knew the enemy could regroup. Private Jack Morrison, only after the fighting slowed, noticed blood soaking through his sleeve. A fragment of shrapnel had lodged in his shoulder. He had not felt it during the assault. When told to report for treatment, he insisted he could still hold a rifle. By early afternoon, landing craft began approaching more cautiously, guided by rope lines established after the initial disaster. Reinforcements and ammunition were brought ashore with greater control. Engineers assessed the reef and surf, reducing further losses. The casualty figures were sobering. Dozens had drowned before engaging the enemy. Others were listed as missing, likely carried out by current. Combat fatalities added to the toll. Exact numbers varied in later reports, but the losses from water alone were significant enough to shape immediate operational reviews. Despite the disruption, the beachhead held. Within 48 hours, additional units reinforced the position. Japanese resistance around Finschhafen continued, but the initial foothold made further advance possible. By 24 September, Australian forces had entered the town after fighting inland. Control of the area allowed construction of air facilities that would support continued operations along the Huon Peninsula. Over the following months, Japanese units in the region were gradually isolated and pushed back. The broader Allied advance through New Guinea maintained its momentum. The landing at what became known as Scarlet Beach influenced future planning. Underwater reconnaissance was given greater emphasis. Amphibious training expanded to include water survival under load. Equipment waterproofing improved. Greater attention was paid to tidal analysis and reef mapping before assault operations. The lessons were practical and direct. For the families of those lost at sea, there were no graves to visit at first. Some of the dead were later interred in established war cemeteries in New Guinea. Others remained listed as missing. Their bodies never recovered. After the war, survivors returned to civilian life in different ways. Morrison went back to rural Queensland. Those who knew him said he rarely spoke about the landing. Henderson resumed maritime work in Sydney, drawing on skills that had helped him survive. Crawford, after long recovery, walked with a permanent limp and pursued his legal career. Brigadier Windire continued his service in the Pacific and later entered judicial life. Official commendations acknowledged leadership and endurance, but personal memories of the reef and surf endured longer than citations. Today, the coastline near Finschhafen appears calm. The reef remains beneath the surface, invisible at high tide. There is little to suggest the violence of that morning. The landing did not achieve fame comparable to larger operations elsewhere in the war, yet its impact was real. It secured a position that allowed continued pressure on Japanese forces in the region. It demonstrated the risks of incomplete intelligence. It reminded planners that geography could be as decisive as gunfire. For those who were there, the first battle was not against an opposing army. It was against water, weight, and darkness. They reached the shore, and because they did, the campaign moved forward.